Hello and welcome to Module 1 of the Continuum of Care CoC 101 training for the Eastern PA Continuum of Care. This training series is going to consist of multiple modules that each build upon one another, and the goal is that each module will help you build a more advanced understanding of what the CoC is and its role in addressing homelessness in your community. My name is Jessica Sones. I work with Diana T. Myers and Associates, and we're a consultant for the Eastern Pennsylvania Continuum of Care. And we are a consultant under contract with the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development, also known as DCD. And DCD is the collaborative applicant and CoC lead for the Eastern PA Continuum of Care. We'll get into later what all of that means, but for now, let's dive into Module 1. So Module 1 is going to cover background and history of the CoC program and give a high-level overview of what the CoC is and how it came about. So a bit of abbreviated history, just to give some context of kind of how the CoC program fits in. In the 1980s, emergency shelters were the primary homeless housing intervention in addressing homelessness. But as you can imagine, and as we all know, homelessness persisted. And as a result, a new model, which was the transitional housing model, emerged to try to get people ready to go into permanent housing from shelter. Fast forward a bit to 2009, 2010, that's when the Hearth Act and opening doors came into play. And we'll talk about what each of those are. But as a result of the Hearth Act and opening doors, housing first became the standard. And housing was seen as a tool to achieve stability rather than something that someone had to earn once stability was achieved. And then in the 2010s, permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing really came to the forefront in terms of housing interventions. Some of the key legislation that has intersected with the work of the CoC is 1986 was the Homeless Eligibility Clarification Act and Homeless Housing Act. In 1987, you may be familiar with the term McKinney-Vento. In 1987, the Stuart B. McKinney Homeless Assistance Act was passed, and that consisted of 15 programs providing a range of services to folks experiencing homelessness. So that included things like emergency shelter, transitional housing, job training, healthcare, education, as well as some permanent housing. And that consisted of 9 different titles within that act that each covered kind of a different branch of what services would be available to folks experiencing homelessness. In 1988, 1990, 92, and 94, the McKinney-Vento Act was amended. And then in 2009, it was reauthorized as the Hearth Act, the Homeless Emergency and Rapid Transition to Housing Act. That was enacted to law in May of 2009. So the goal of the Hearth Act was to end homelessness rather than just manage homelessness. And this was a paradigm shift. The other part of the paradigm shift was that the Hearth Act really emphasized a holistic look at homeless services, not just the programs funded by HUD, but collaborating with other resources for folks experiencing homelessness. The Hearth Act placed a heavy emphasis on the CoC organizational structure and planning. We'll get into that a little bit later, but it really focused on how CoCs operate and how they structure their work. The Hearth Act emphasized a coordination in planning. Some of the things of note are the 10-year plan to end homelessness, consolidated plans, ESG planning. Other community plans should all be kind of integrated into how you're planning to address homelessness in your community. And another major area of focus was on outcomes and data. How do we measure whether the homeless system is successful? And part of this was emphasizing full participation in HMIS by all the programs in the community who are serving folks experiencing homelessness. So some of the concrete things that the Hearth Act did was it revised the definition of homelessness, which we'll get to on the next slide. The emergency shelter program was revised and renamed to the Emergency Solutions Program. The Hearth Act consolidated different homeless assistance programs and also codified into law the continuum of care planning process. So in terms of the definition of homelessness under the Hearth Act defined homelessness in 4 different categories. Category 1 is literally homeless. Those are folks who are living in a place not meant for human habitation, such as living on the streets or in their car, folks who are in emergency shelter or transitional housing. Category 2 is folks who are at imminent risk of homelessness, meaning those who are at risk of homelessness in the immediate future but are not currently homeless. Category 3, homeless under other federal statutes. This includes folks who are homeless under the Department of Education McKinney-Vento program, for example, folks who are couch surfing and doubled up. And then category 4 is folks who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, sexual assault, human trafficking. So within different federal programs, different of these homeless categories may be eligible. For example, in CoC funded housing programs, typically only category 1 and category 4 are eligible. So folks who are either literally homeless or fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. The Department of Education, on the other hand, has a different and more broad definition of homelessness, which includes folks who are couch surfing and doubled up. These different definitions can sometimes create challenges for people who are seeking to access assistance through the homeless system. In general, for CoC and ESG funded programs, folks who are at risk of homelessness are eligible for homeless prevention resources or, if needed, emergency shelter. Whereas folks who are literally homeless or fleeing domestic violence, this category 1 and 4, would be eligible for CoC and ESG funded housing resources such as transitional housing, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing. We'll talk more about these different housing types on the next slide. So this slide breaks down what can be funded through the Emergency Solutions Grant Program and the Continuum of Care Program. These are 2 of the largest programs providing funding to serve folks who are experiencing homelessness. So the Emergency Solutions Grant Program can fund street outreach, homeless prevention, emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, as well as HMIS, which is the database used to collect and analyze data on all the homeless assistance programs in the CoC. And then the Continuum of Care Program can provide funding for some of those things, but also some different things. So the CoC funding funds CoC planning. We'll get into that a little bit later. That's basically how you're making sure that your CoC is fulfilling its obligations to HUD and doing that CoC-wide coordination. CoC funding can pay for coordinated entry services, some supportive services. However, typically this is only for renewals, so programs that have already been around. Typically, we're not able to fund new supportive service only projects. Can fund HMIS, Safe Haven, again, only for renewal projects, transitional housing, also only for renewal projects. CoC funding can provide rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, as well as this joint component transitional housing, rapid rehousing. This is a newer project type from HUD that basically combines transitional housing and rapid rehousing into one project type, where the people who are in this program can go to transitional housing, then to rapid rehousing, or maybe they just need transitional housing or just need rapid rehousing. But it is a model that's really driven by client choice and getting folks to the most appropriate resource that they need. So I mentioned Opening Doors. Opening Doors is the federal strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness, which was published in 2010. And the major goals of Opening Doors were: 1, to prevent and end homelessness among veterans in 2015, to finish ending chronic homelessness by 2017, to prevent and end homelessness for families, youth, and children by 2020, and then to set a path to end all types of homelessness. There's been quite a bit of success nationally with ending veterans homelessness. different continuums of care have been able to basically effectively end veterans' homelessness, which we'll talk about in a minute. But some of these other goals are still a work in progress, and we anticipate that HUD will release a new strategic plan sometime in the near future. So I mentioned that some communities have effectively ended veterans' homelessness. So what does that mean? The term that's often used is functional zero. Functional zero is the state when our homeless system has enough capacity and resources to prevent homelessness when possible and to immediately permanently house those experiencing homelessness now and in the future. It doesn't mean that, for example, if you have a community that's effectively ended veterans' homelessness, it doesn't mean that a veteran will never become homeless again. It means that your system can quickly identify that person, can prevent their homelessness as much as possible with different resources. And if that veteran becomes homelessness, there is a resource immediately available to house them. So that is just a little bit about the functional zero ending homelessness concept. For those who are not familiar with the term HUD SNAPs, SNAPs is the Office of Special Needs Assistance Program, and that's the office where the CoC program sits. So the HUD SNAPs has certain policy priorities that sort of guide the work of the continuum of care. 1, ending homelessness for all persons. 2, creating a systemic response to homelessness. 3, strategically allocating and using resources. And 4, using a housing first approach. So you may or may not be familiar with the housing first principle. Housing first really is the guiding principle for the homeless response system. And housing first basically notes that homelessness is a housing crisis, and the solution to a housing crisis is safe and affordable housing. And everyone who's experiencing homelessness, regardless of their history, how long they've been homeless, can achieve housing stability and permanent housing. That is what the housing first principle believes. It believes that everyone is housing ready, meaning that you should not be requiring things like sobriety, compliance and treatment, or even a clean criminal history in order for someone to obtain housing. Those things are not necessary to succeed in housing, because once someone is housed, they're much more able to focus on the other needs that they have in their life. Whereas if you're actively homeless, it is more challenging to achieve a state, for example, of sobriety or mental health treatment. Many people will experience vast improvements in their quality of life when they achieve housing. This could be related to health, mental health, substance use, employment. People experiencing homelessness have the right to choice and self-determination, should be treated with dignity and respect. And then it should be a model that's flexible and tailored to the needs of the individual. So the exact way that you set up your housing or your services really should be driven by the needs and preferences of the folks that you're serving. So again, housing first is really the principle that guides the work of the homeless response system. Some of the components of an effective crisis response system that HUD has put forward is: 1, the system follows a low barrier housing first approach. 2, the system is housing focused, meaning you may have a variety of things that someone experiencing homelessness wants to work on, but housing should always be the foundation, the goal, what you're working towards. And the other pieces are important, but you can't lose sight of the goal of permanent housing, permanent safe housing. The effective crisis response system promotes flow through the system, meaning needing to identify if there are places where folks may be getting stuck. Are a lot of folks staying in shelter for a really long time? And if so, what is the reason for that? Is it because there are not enough permanent housing resources? Things like that. Trying to identify where are their gaps, where are there deficiencies in the system that are preventing folks from achieving permanent housing, and working to address those. An effective system promotes diversion whenever possible, meaning trying to identify alternate resources that folks may have in their own natural support network to help avoid the homeless system whenever possible. And then an effective system also prioritizes the most expensive interventions for those with the most intense needs, so those with the longest histories of homelessness and the most severe needs. So for example, Permanent supportive housing, which is a service-intensive intervention, should be prioritized for those who have a long history of homelessness, folks who are chronically homeless, folks who really are going to need those intensive supportive services long term. A couple of slides to give you a snapshot of the data in the Eastern PA CoC. So the point in time count is a snapshot at a single point in time, one night in January, of homelessness in the CoC. So you'll see here that the goal back in 2016, when the CoC strategic plan was implemented, the total numbers from the point in time count were 2,599 people experiencing homelessness on the night of the point in time count. And you see that has gone down from 2017, 2018, 2019, went up again a bit in 2020. And then the goal for 2021 was 1,300 people. The CoC still has a ways to go towards this goal, but the CoC is setting aggressive goals to try to continue to reduce homelessness in the CoC. We'll note that the point in time count has many limitations in understanding the full picture of homelessness. First of all, it only captures a single night. We also know that homelessness is often hidden and folks may not be identified during the point in time count. However, HUD requires the point in time count, and this is a way of tracking homelessness year over year with a consistent methodology. Another way to look at what homelessness looks like in the Eastern PA CoC is looking at coordinated entry enrollment. So we'll talk more about coordinated entry in a later session. So these are households who are seeking services due to housing instability or homelessness. This includes both folks who are at risk of homelessness as well as those who are literally homeless. So as you can see, the number of folks who are reaching out to the Eastern PA CoC coordinated entry system from 2018 to 2020 has steadily increased. And we'll talk more about coordinated entry later. The coordinated entry system has become more accessible and more advanced over the last few years. So some of this increase could be related to the fact that the coordinated entry system is becoming more accessible to folks. However, both this slide and the previous slide just want to note that understanding the true picture of homelessness is complex. There's not one single way of measuring homelessness that tells the whole story, but hopefully this data provides you some context. Some key terms for reference, I'm not going to go through all of these, but you may see these terms come up, these acronyms, and we just want you to have a reference point so that you're familiar with what they mean. So let me just run through a couple of them. BNL is the by name list that's used in the coordinated entry system, kind of manage and understand who is in need of homeless assistance services in the CoC. We'll talk more about that later. I mentioned earlier DCED, the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development. That is the CoC lead agency and collaborative applicant. DMA, Diana T. Myers and Associates, we're the consultant for the Eastern PA CoC. You see some acronyms about different housing types like emergency shelter. You'll see ESG, the Emergency Solutions Grant. HUD, hopefully folks may be familiar with that, which is the US Department of Housing and Urban Development. PA 509, that is the HUD code for the Eastern PA CoC. So you ever see the term PA 509, that's simply referring to the Eastern Pennsylvania Continuum of Care. We talked about PIT, which is the point in time count. One other term that you may hear pop up is the VI-SPDAT, which is the Vulnerability Index Service Prioritization and Decision Assistance Tool. This is a tool that's used in the coordinated entry system to help prioritize folks for different housing resources. We'll talk about most of these acronyms in future modules. So thank you for joining Module 1. We hope to see you back for Module 2.